Dear awakening souls out there, welcome to the Here and Now. I'm your host, Roxana, your spiritual guide, hero's journey and transformation coach, and this is the Conscious Cruising Podcast. This podcast aims at connecting and unifying like-minded people. If these reflections resonate with you, please consider liking and sharing the video, and even better, subscribe to the channel. You'll be helping this to grow into a community of awakened individuals, all living with the same goal in mind: freedom and personal sovereignty. This week, I wanted to share with you more about how the brain works in parallel ways. Underneath our distressing ways of being, there's a version of us that has amazing capacity and care. Unfortunately, this is not yet realized or even recognized by the mainstream. But you can find out more about this on podcasts such as this one. As Big Pharma and the mainstream healing system continue to lose credibility, not only in the way of lack of integrity, but also in lack of effectiveness in achieving well-being, we gradually realize that human beings truly have a great capacity to heal themselves. New alternative ways of healing are gaining in approval due to their undeniable effectiveness. To mention the groundbreaking work of just one individual researcher, and there are many out there, take a look at Joe Dispenza's body of work and research done over the course of 2 decades or more that show amazing results on hundreds of thousands of people who spontaneously healed chronic illnesses and other deadly diseases. Dr. Dispenza, as well, healed by himself from a sure spinal paralysis with the power of meditation and powerful mental practices over a relative short amount of time. The Buddha as well, before Christ even, declared and proved that people have the capacity to heal themselves with the power of concentration and consciousness and awareness. As a long-term practitioner of Buddhism and researcher on the Buddhist theory of the origin of illness, I myself have experienced a similar type of healing in my personal life. In plain words, Buddhism affirms that illness stems from a fundamental ignorance of one's immense power. As the effectiveness of personal development work continues to evolve, we are developing a completely new understanding of how our internal systems, physical, psychological, and emotional, work together. When we learn to understand the effect that our unconscious mind has on our conscious self, when we learn to tap into that infinite power, humans have the ability to heal themselves in natural ways on an energetic level. Shadow work with deprogramming is a super effective way to alchemize or transform unconscious negative programming into a healed mindset that can positively influence the whole body on a vibrational and somatic level and achieve heart cohesion with the brain, with our thoughts, as it's called in the field of epigenetics. Ascension simply means the expansion of our awareness and the elevation of our level of being onto a higher frequency. In other words, we have come to discover that we are enveloped in an energy field called LEF, or luminous energy field, commonly known as the light body. Taking care of our magnetic field is super important because this field surrounds our body to protect us from external attacks of any kind. Shadow work is not only able to aid our spiritual development, but is a tool to remove unconscious causes, such as limiting beliefs and many more things besides, that are the true reason for physical illness. One thing that is amazing about contemporary shadow work is that it teaches us, as the client, how to become our own therapist and, in a way, our own healer. We also use the term leader to mean the same thing, because the process of releasing trapped energy in the body and mind and integrating that shadow after transmutation puts us in contact with a somewhat hidden potential self, what you might think as our higher self. And that higher self is in charge, is the leader. We don't think from a victim perspective anymore. We are the leader of our lives, rather than letting our lives happen to us. Getting in touch with that higher part of ourself is so invaluable. In other words, it doesn't just undo a disorder and help us come to function at a baseline. It goes beyond that. It takes us to this really resourceful state. This state is like an enlightened version of ourselves. Even if you're thinking, believe me, I'm not enlightened. I'm definitely not an enlightened person. I binge eating, I drink too much, I have a really hot temper, I'm really insecure. That's just who I really am. That's the only me I've ever known. That's just part of being human in this dense reality, in this dense realm. But we are actually our higher self anyway. In fact, we really start with direct focus upon the parts of ourselves that we struggle with. The difference is we approach those parts as just that, as parts, not the whole. And actually, we use our higher self to approach those parts with compassion. But before we really explore why it is absolutely more accurate to think in terms of parts, I just want to start with appreciating why it's also more respectful to see them as parts. It's important to think in terms of parts in order to avoid identifying with any of these parts, which are actually more to do with the egoic self rather than our authentic higher self. Therefore, if someone has an addiction, like drinking for example, it would be disrespectful, detrimental and false to say that they are alcoholic, and I underline the word are, like a label. Because in actual fact, they are a more complex human being who has a part of them that feels compelled to drink, probably motivated by unresolved trauma. It may be a part of them, but that part is not the totality of their selfhood, nor it defines who they are. They don't need to identify with an aspect that doesn't actually define who they are. But what does this concept of parts have to do with the enlightened version of ourselves? Well, when we can understand these parts of our identity that we struggle with, the moment we realize they are just one facet of ourselves, it allows us to step back in a way and able to finally actually see this part more clearly, and more importantly, to approach it with compassion and curiosity. I think most people are aware that we all have different parts of our personality. What I think most people don't fully appreciate is how distinct these parts can be. So much so that we aren't just like one person in a way. Not that we have multiple personality in some pathological sense. It's just actually normal and adaptive to have various aspects of our personality, our parts that take the lead at different moments. As in, a part of me wants to go for that promotion, but another part of me wants to turn it down and is pushing me to stay invisible, to stay within the comfort zone. A part of me does believe I'm a good person, but another part is always telling me I'm bad, or I feel this inner sense of badness. You may even be aware that you have some parts of yourself that you like and others that you hate and internally scapegoat. Like, I hate that part of me that overeats or rages or drinks too much. Some parts you might even be scared of, like your inner critic. Like, I really better not make a mistake because I don't want to trigger my inner critic, I'm really frightened of that, and then I get annoyed all day long and I feel in a bad mood. Now, I like this idea of parts as it's pretty intuitive and user-friendly for most people. But I'm aware that it can also sound new agey or just hard to take seriously. But I can tell you that there's nothing more scientific than the concept of parts. It's not a question of whether our brain works this way. It is a proven fact that the brain works this way in terms of multiplicity. To put it into computer language, we would say that our brains are parallel processors. So most of our psychology, from how we experience the world to how we respond to it, is really based on learning, but not conscious, explicit memory type of learning, like 2 + 2 = 4. Rather, the learning that exists in what's called implicit memory. In implicit memory, particularly the type we might call long-term memory, we learn how to be, how to do. It's not about remembering fact. It's embodied memory, like tying your shoes, riding a bicycle, driving a car. Once we learned all that, we do it automatically. No matter how many years later, you might have stopped driving and then 10 years later you pick up a car and in a few minutes you know exactly how to do it again. Often people use the term muscle memory to mean implicit memory, but of course it's not literal. It's just that the deeper parts of our brain are able to do sophisticated calculations really quickly and feed us that information immediately. Like when we're cycling and when we perceive a slight loss of balance from one side, we instinctively move in the opposite direction in order to keep balance on our bike. That's implicit memory. It's instinctive. In the same way, our childhood experiences and implicit memory create our parts. So we're trying to keep upright psychologically as well. Really, our brain's main job is to make sure that we survive. So psychologically upright means well-fed, well-rested, and connected to the group, because we died without the tribe. And when it comes to stay connected to the group for survival, that's where our psychologies really come in. For example, if we try to go for something, but we get a shaming look from our mother, we immediately pull back because we need that relationship to be back upright, like we're doing on a bicycle. Or if something we're doing seems to hurt somebody else, we might pull back and stay upright again. In fact, we learn in an almost muscle memory way to not do it again, instinctively. This example of pulling back or inhibiting highlights the truth that most of our conditioning is around inhibiting ourselves. But we could also learn that the only way to get any attention in our family is to demand and scream and yell that we have a need that needs to be met. So maybe leaning in is what is learned. We learn to adjust and suppress our needs in order to be accepted and to be civil. We also learn things to stay safe. Things like, maybe I've learned that if I lean in with some vulnerability, my wife will help me feel safe and understand what's going on, and then we bond and learn and come back together in a better place than even before I felt shaky. So That's a more healing type of learning, and that happens too. But either way, whether it's about traumatizing learnings or healing learnings, the bottom line is our brain learns through experience how to survive, and then we repeat that learned thing almost in an instinctive way in the future because it worked the first time. And so if we use it again the second time, that's a reinforcement because it shows us that we are being accepted again. And by the time we grow up and we are independent and we don't need to be so compliant anymore, it's too late. We need to do focused work. We need to make an effort to actually change those patterns. In any case, this is doing or acting through memory, not through logic. This instinctual way of reacting. That's why most of what we do isn't conscious or cognitive, even when we think that we are rational, like taking certain decisions in the boardroom. It's an illusion. It's just an illusion. Yeah, this is a really important point, because I know we all think we're making choices based on rational thought, but honestly, most of the ways we move through the world are really just psychological muscle memory, or emotional in a way. To give an example from our inner world, we may think, oh, I felt this sadness, but then I got overwhelmed, so I better not feel that again. If we want to heal, that's exactly what we should not do. We need to look at those things that we run away from in order to heal, in order to integrate it and reach and achieve well-being. Why do we have many different parts? Now, if you get the idea that we develop these instinctual ways of being and reacting, where we're not even that conscious of why we're driven to respond like that, the next thing is to realize that we don't just develop one way of responding or being. In other words, we don't just develop one personality. We develop different ways of being in different contexts, or around different needs, or around different dangers, even around different types of people, for instance. How should I be around an authority figure? Why? Because different contexts might require a different strategy. Let's say your parents are divorced, and when you go and stay with your mother now, because when you were a child she was very critical of you, your whole body learned to tense up in that house, as if reminding you to walk on eggshells and hold things in. Maybe she was also threatened by your intelligence and needed to be like the one who knows more, because she was your mother, she had authority over you. So your brain learned around mum to drop by 20 IQ points. While your mum was critical, let's say your dad was very relaxed and unthreatened by you, so you could just be yourself. Therefore, at his house, even today as an adult, your shoulders would relax more. You're standing taller. You just feel different in your body and certainly in your emotions. Maybe your dad actually enjoys your witty humor, and you find that the playful part of you really comes out and expresses itself freely when you are around your father. Now remember, these are learnings, learned ways of being, and they aren't learned in order to be forgotten. They are learned in order to be remembered for the rest of your life, in implicit memory, for the rest of your life, or until challenged in order to be transformed, if you want to. Why do we need to remember them? Well, so that the next moment you walk into your mum's house, you won't forget how to be. The smell, the sight, the sound of her voice, and bam, that learning kicks in to protect you. And suddenly, when that muscle memory is triggered, which is really just like a pattern of neural firing in your brain, that's a memory. That's what a memory is. It's a pattern of neural firing. when that pattern fires, it's really as if you are a different person, because you need to be a different person around your mom. For instance, even if you made the conscious choice of going to be funny, yes, I'm going to be funny around mom, nothing funny would come to mind. That playful part of you that comes out when you're with your dad still exists somewhere else, because it will come up again next time you visit your father. Remember, the brain has a parallel processor, but in that moment, it's not on the same track you're on neurologically, if that makes sense. So hopefully, this example gives you a sense of how we develop different parts of our personality that are really pretty different. The person you learned to be or were allowed to be with your mother was pretty different than the person you learned to be or were allowed to be around your dad. And hopefully it's clear now why these patterns would need to be stored in memory, in the same way that you might have a how to ride a bike memory file, different part of the brain, or the CPU. But the important thing is there are no bad parts. Now, the next thing to understand is that the person you learn to be with your mom, it generalizes to other similar contexts. So it's really about learning how to be around people like mom. So even when you're an adult, when you are with someone who is critical, like your mom, that part of you will come out to protect you in similar situations in an automatic way. Maybe your boss reminds you of your mom, and when she's around, you suddenly do that thing where you drop 20 IQ points, which is obviously not ideal. And that is the next point to make, because there is a cost to the fact that our brain works this way. The fact that we develop these parts or patterns, or what we called programs in deprogramming coaching, contributes to a huge portion of human suffering. Not all suffering comes from parts. If your child dies, you will suffer, of course. If you experience racial oppression, you will suffer, surely. But that suffering that comes from what we think of as our issue comes from the fact that we are wired to have parts. There's a certain inflexibility or even lack of control that comes into play when our parts take over. It's almost as a program, it doesn't have, you can't reason with it. That leads to what we called being triggered. And that can be very disempowering, particularly if those parts have learned to protect us by drinking or cutting or raging or starving ourselves or attacking us through an inner critic. That being said, while parts can produce suffering for us, which is of course why we work with them in deprogramming coaching, there is a very foundational philosophical and scientific stance that deprogramming coaching takes towards parts, and that is the statement: there are no bad parts, there are no bad programs, because it's all created by us. In fact, this particular type of part I've been describing is a protector, because these parts came out, learned to do what they do in order to protect us, especially when we were children and we were dependent from our parents or our carers. So even parts that seem self-sabotaging, like our inner critic, for instance, really has learned that we will be better off with that criticism rather than without. So there isn't any part of you, even the negative ones, that are actually out to get you. Everything is geared in your psyche towards protecting you and doing the right thing for you. Every part of us is just trying to do its job to keep us safe. Because let's face it, when we created those programs, we were children, we were dependent, and they protected us. So if we judge negatively and combat any part of us, even a part that hurts others, like maybe yelling at our loved ones is just going to be more confused and scared and probably fights back harder. But if we respect every part of our mind, rational or irrational, slow down, listen to it, speaking with it, mentor it, relating to it with compassion, things can actually change. When our parts can feel the more conscious adult version of our mind, taking notice of it, and kindly trying to help it, they can step out of the leadership position because they finally feel there is something greater to surrender to. Think about it. This is the power of surrendering and releasing in deprogramming. And it allows the parts to finally be a bit free of the burdensome job they had to protect us. And that is what deprogramming coaching is all about. It's no longer called therapy because the term therapy implies that, I don't know, something limiting. It certainly doesn't give the idea of the leader who self-heals. The coach is simply a guide that helps the client to navigate those parts. But it's just a guide. It's not suggesting anything, it's not giving any solution. You are in charge throughout the whole sessions. So we learn to slow down and mindfully track, explore and converse with aspects of our personality that we find troubling, really thinking of them as parts, not as a whole of who we are. Parts to love, who need to be heard and addressed compassionately and with respect, because that's part of self-love. In the past, they took on their unique way of being in order to help us survive. And while on the surface we might not understand why they needed to do that particular thing in order to protect us, if we track it down and actually listen to the part, the story can unfold. In the past, they took on their unique way of being in order to help us survive. And while on the surface we might not understand why they needed to do that particular thing in order to protect us, if we track it down and actually listen to the part, the story can unfold. How it learned what it learned, the history of that. And I use the word history here purposely because each part has its own secret history. I would like to draw from a poem by Longfellow that reads, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility." I think that is such a powerful line in terms of not judging others because we don't know how they suffered. But in truth, we often don't really know how we've suffered as well and how we had to adapt in order to survive. We haven't let ourselves connect the dots on it. Internally, each part of our heart, jealous or scared, has its own secret history, one that only our parts can truly reveal to us. And when we can discover these histories and approach our parts with compassion, it changes everything. Why? Because when understanding and compassion are given to our parts, to ourselves, it allows for some really deep healing work, some real transformational work, where these parts of ours can finally feel safe enough to relax, to come out of this almost trauma drive to control us, and instead let our inner adult take charge. It's as if through our love towards them, they can realize they aren't in the trauma scene anymore. And once we've done that with ourselves, not only we're at peace, but we understand the mechanism in the people around us. And we can actually feel a lot more compassion. And that's how we learn to express unconditional love. It's as if through our love towards them, they can realize they aren't in the trauma scene anymore. These people who've been fighting with us. And that's powerful. Because there's a way we are dealing with human consciousness. It's a human history. It's not a what. it's a who. So when I work with a client, whatever they have, I'm not thinking what is having that trauma. Is it a chemical imbalance? Is it a coping strategy? How do I get rid of it? No, I'm thinking of who is having that trauma. Who in there gave up hope and why? Or who in there decided to compensate in this manner? Who in there got so punished for their anger that they learned to shut down instead? That part needs someone to find it and build a relationship with it, to listen to it, because just like with humans, a part will only be able to change, to learn and shift once it feels heard first, just like a small child. Once its secret history is known and its fears addressed, that's how safety is established. The dark, the shadow, becomes bright, becomes light, becomes seen and lit. Feeling heard, especially around our fears, is the first step, always. That being said, there are actually a number of interesting pieces in deprogramming coaching that we haven't addressed yet, and I think that they're worth exploring. So there's more to it than just these parts. Yeah, you might be left wondering, well, if I'm just a collection of various learned ways of being, then which part of me is the real me? Who am I then? It turns out that deprogramming has a very clear and very inspiring answer to that question. And that answer is a key piece of what is so healing about deprogramming. So let's go there next. And for that reason, I'd like to invite you to join my free upcoming masterclass on deprogramming. You can register following the link in the description below. Thank you for watching me this far, for following till the end. I hope you found this episode helpful. And if you did, you can help me out by liking and sharing the video and subscribing to the channel. You'll be helping the channel to grow into a community of awakened individuals, all living with the same goal in mind: freedom and personal sovereignty. Now is the time to step outside our boxes and just connect with like-minded people to share our insights and curiosity. If you want to know more, leave a comment in the section below or reach out. You're very welcome to connect. I thank you for listening. My name is Roxana Fiamma. I'm your spiritual guide, hero's journey and transformation coach, and this was the Conscious Cruising Podcast. your fire.